So what happens when a really influential online voice starts producing results that seem to do nothing but sow division, whether they mean to or not? Today we're going to dig into a pretty provocative analysis of the commentator Tariq Nasheed, and the focus here isn't on what he believes, but on the real-world function of his words.
So, the whole thing kicks off with this big question. Is his influence, in practice, mirroring the objectives of a political agent? Now, let's be clear, this isn't about some spy movie plot with secret meetings or government paychecks. No, this is all about looking at the actual, measurable effects his messaging has on community bonds and, what people are focused on politically.
Okay, before we dive any deeper, we have to get this one thing crystal clear because the entire argument hinges on it. This is an analysis of function, not intent. The point isn't to try and read his mind or figure out his motives. It's simply to observe the patterns and the tangible results of his public actions. What actually happens in the real world? That's the only question.
So, to really get what this analysis is arguing, we have to start with their key term, agent behavior. And they use this in a very specific political science kind of way, which is probably pretty different from how you and I might usually hear it.
And this slide right here is where it all clicks into place. It totally reframes the idea. So we're moving away from that classic spy movie version, secret payments from some foreign power. Instead, we're looking at a purely functional definition that's all about political outcomes. The only questions that matter are, what does the behavior actually do? Does it create division inside a group? Does it redirect anger away from the powerful and toward peers? Does it weaken solidarity? That's the entire framework.
So here's the bottom line. The whole argument boils down to observable patterns and their real-world consequences. Just like the quote says, what someone claims to believe just doesn't matter as much as what their behavior actually produces.
Okay, so with that rulebook established, the analysis builds its case on 4 really consistent patterns that it identifies. Let's walk through them one by one. So, the very first pattern the analysis highlights is this consistent focus on conflict within the African diaspora. We're talking specifically about rhetoric that pits Black Americans against Black immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean.
And this happens by framing these groups not as potential allies with shared interests, but as cultural outsiders, economic competitors, or even historical enemies. The result is that it just breeds suspicion and slams the door on opportunities for cooperation. So instead of everyone focusing on shared economic and political goals, the whole conversation gets bogged down in grievances based on where your great-great-grandparents were from.
All right, the second pattern builds right on top of that first one, and it's all about the use of history. The argument is that history isn't being used here to bring clarity, but for something else entirely, something the author calls narrative displacement. So what does that actually look like? Well, it means overemphasizing the role that some African groups played in the transatlantic slave trade, while at the same time kind of downplaying the absolute industrial and financial dominance of the European powers who designed, funded, and ran the entire horrific system. And the functional result of that? The main architects of racial capitalism sort of fade into the background, and potential allies, well, they get recast as the primary villains of the story.
And that leads us straight into the third pattern this analysis points to, which is all about a simple question. Where is the audience's anger and attention ultimately being pointed? Who is the final target of all of this grievance? This slide just lays it out perfectly. The argument is that time and again, anger is redirected away from the actual structures of power, corporations, government policies, the justice system, and instead it's focused inward onto other Black people. The debate becomes about who counts as Black, who owes who doesn't belong here, which functionally is a massive distraction from confronting any real external power. It's a classic divide and conquer move, right?
And finally, for the fourth pattern, the analysis kind of pulls the camera back to look at the bigger picture, the market forces and social media algorithms that actually reward and amplify this exact type of content. It's the business side of things.
You see, this creates a really potent feedback loop. It goes like this. Divisive content creates outrage, which drives clicks and comments, high engagement. The platform algorithms see that high engagement and they push the content out to even more people. Then, as the audience gets more and more invested, their whole identity starts to harden around this conflict, which just makes them demand more of the same content. At that point, the author argues, division isn't just some unfortunate byproduct anymore. It's become the core product. It's the business model.
So, okay, we've walked through the 4 patterns: diaspora division, selective history, misdirected anger, and the financial incentives. So where does all of this leave us with that original, really provocative question?
To try and explain these outcomes, the analysis basically considers three different possibilities, kind of starting with the most extreme and working its way to the one it says is most supported by what we can actually see.
Right, so the analysis is super clear on the first one. There's just no public evidence to support the conscious agent claim. Done. The unwitting asset idea is seen as plausible, sure, but ultimately the conclusion that it lands on, the one that holds up best based on what's observable, is that third option. An independent actor whose behavior, regardless of his intent, functionally serves to weaken Black collective power.
So, finally, the analysis zooms all the way out to answer what's probably the most important question of all. Why does any of this even matter? What are the real stakes here when we start looking at outcomes instead of just intentions?
And man, this quote really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? The big takeaway here is that, historically speaking, internal division has always been the key vulnerability, the Achilles heel, for any marginalized community that's trying to build real collective power.
And the conclusion from that is pretty stark. Because internal fracture is so incredibly dangerous, there's a kind of public responsibility to critically examine the outcomes created by any influential voice. It doesn't matter how charismatic they are or how popular they are. The results are what count.
And so, that's where we end, with the exact question the analysis wants to leave us with. And it's not meant as a personal gotcha or anything like that. It's meant as a crucial demand for clarity. When you see these patterns and you see these results, you're forced to step back and just ask the simple, powerful question: who does this ultimately serve?